the Vietnam guys, and I see the POW MIA flags, and it never meant anything to me, but it does now. And there is an obligation, I think, to these heroes that, you feel it. Get his bones, find out what happened to him.
That same question continues to hang over the almost 2,000 servicemen still classified as missing in action from the Vietnam War.
Most of the people lost in North Vietnam were pilots. And the pilots were better educated, and they came from families with, more wealth and more political influence.
These are your men.
And they began to organize in the early 1970s.
The campaign for the POWs and MIAs caught on nationwide. It was an issue that even people who disagreed with America's participation in the war could support.
By conservative counts, over 50 million people in our country have participated in campaigns expressing concern for these men.
By the early 1970s, 5 million Americans were wearing bracelets inscribed with the names of MIAs. An organization of POW and MIA families created a special flag that bears the words, "You are not forgotten." It was the only flag to fly beside the Stars and Stripes at the White House.
All of our American POWs are on their way home.
The nationwide campaign seemed to pay off when the U.S. signed a peace agreement with North Vietnam in January 1973. But Hanoi released only 591 American POWs out of the estimated 3,200 listed as missing in action in Southeast Asia.
It was my sense, and I think it was a sense of most people involved and most people at the policy level, that we would at some point in the future receive an additional number of Americans returning.
The world should know that this administration.
It wasn't until the election of Ronald Reagan that the issue of the missing moved to the government's front burner. Reagan sent the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Vesey, to Hanoi in late 1987 as his special emissary. Vesey brought a so-called discrepancy list of 196 MIA cases that he hoped the Vietnamese would help resolve.
The 196 cases were selected on the fact that those cases would most likely be the cases that the Vietnamese could reasonably account for.
Search operations with the Vietnamese continued through the rest of the 80s. In January 1992, the effort was turned over to a new Department of Defense office called the Joint Task Force Full Accounting.
If you remember, there were many movies about unaccounted for being over there, the Rambo movies. A lot of these movies portrayed Americans still being held prisoner, and that was the top priority for Joint Task Force Full Accounting, and that was one of the key reasons that we were formed.
In 1991, shortly after the birth of his son Robert, John McDonnell started looking for answers about what happened to his father, an Army helicopter pilot who had disappeared in Vietnam in March 1969.
Just something internally came over me that said at some point in this guy's life he was going to ask me about my dad. So I thought it'd be good to investigate and find out more about my dad, and so I could answer his questions.
John's father, Army Captain John Terence McDonnell, was serving his third tour of duty in Vietnam, attached to the Aerial Rocket Artillery Unit of the 101st Airborne Division. His previous tours had been with Special Forces, where McDonnell had received extensive training in survival techniques.
I never flew with him, but I can tell you I sure wanted to. John would be invaluable if anything happened and you were shot down.
In late December 1968, McDonnell was home for the last time.
He left probably a few days before my 7th birthday. And it was a dark day, you know, the middle of winter is pretty dark, and so he was leaving in the evening to fly out. So I remember him closing the door and walking away, so that was it.
On March 6, 1969, McDonnell, along with fellow pilot Lieutenant Ronald Greenfield, was on a mission to take out some enemy mortar sites southeast of the ancient imperial city of Hue. The weather was marginal.
It was really a bad day. It was really a bad day. Where we flew in Vietnam was lots of mountains, and that day the fog and the clouds had gone almost all the way down to the ground.
Suddenly, McDonnell's helicopter took enemy fire and crashed into the side of a mountain. A search and rescue operation was immediately mounted to find the missing men.
We were back on Camp Eagle, and I was notified that the ARA aircraft had gone down, and the two people in there were Ron Greenfield and John McDonnell, and I knew them because I had been in their unit previously, and I asked if I could take that mission.
But in the fog and dense jungle terrain, no one could find the downed helicopter.
And I remember a sinking feeling in my stomach that we weren't able to find the aircraft or both pilots, and they may not survive the night.
It wasn't until the next afternoon that Bob Black's medevac team found McDonnell's crash site, with a seriously injured Ron Greenfield lying next to the chopper, but no sign of John.
John's helmet was in the aircraft, but no signs of any trauma in his part of the cockpit or blood or anything. So it assumed that possibly he got out with rather minor injuries.
I remember thinking that he would escape and evade on his own towards the coast in what's called Highway 1.
For 20 days, the search for Captain McDonnell continued.
Lots of aircraft time, people put on the ground. It was an exhaustive search of that area.
John McDonnell was never found.
His family believed he had been taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese.
But after 1973, and he didn't come back during Operation Homecoming, then what else can you think? Nixon said all the POWs that are alive are back. By then, we'd pretty much given up that there was any hope of him being alive.
So in 1977, 8 years after his disappearance, Becky McDonnell had her husband declared legally dead.
She asked where I thought that we ought to put his gravestone. So I thought, well, we were living in Mojave, California at the time, and it didn't make much sense to put it out there. He was from Fort Worth. I didn't know anybody from Fort Worth, so it didn't make much sense to put it over there. And he had the option of being in Arlington, so we put the headstone in Arlington.
His mother remarried, and the family moved on. Then, in the early 90s, John requested a copy of his father's casualty file. When the 2-foot stack of papers arrived, John realized the government had a special interest in the case.
The McDonnell case is one of the cases that was on General Vesey's discrepancy case list, the 196 last known alive list.
But as he started going through the reports, John was surprised at the inconsistencies.
There's a lot of information there that was really ambiguous, and you really couldn't tell what happened.
Witnesses told Bill Bell they saw an American soldier near the crash site who was severely wounded while resisting arrest. The North Vietnamese captured the man and was taking him to communist headquarters.
And he died en route. And then they buried his body in a shallow grave on a stream bank on the slope of a hill. And then later on, the body washed away, and there's no evidence of, or no remains left.
Other witnesses led investigators to different locations where they said John McDonnell was buried.
We've done excavations in 2 particular sites, and we're not able to find remains at either one of them.
It's very unusual not to find at least some evidence of a burial at a burial site. We did not find any snaps, any buttons, a pocket comb, a lighter, any personal effects, or any indication that anyone was ever buried there.
Other documents John discovered in his father's file were even more curious. They led to another trail, one of live or bright light sightings, named after a wartime program designed to illuminate the issue. In 1971, a North Vietnamese defector made a bright light sighting in a POW camp in Laos. He gave a description of a man who resembled Captain McDonnell.
One of the prisoners was 30 years old, at 1.8 meters tall. He weighed about 90 kilos. He says he has a heavy build, a pink complexion, a long face, short brownish blonde hair.
Another bright light sighting, one that makes the most sense to former investigator Bell, was reported in 1973 by another defector.
who said he saw a captain who was an artillery captain, and his name was John, and he was from Texas, and he was married and had 2 children, and he had an 1.5 inch scar over his left ear. That particular witness saw him in Quang Ngai province, where he was said to be teaching artillery to an artillery unit of the communists. Under threat of execution is the way that the witness described it.
Then, in 1991, investigators came across Captain McDonnell's ID in a military museum in Hue. According to museum records, it had been there since 1975, 2 years after all POWs had presumably come home.
It shows that he was in the Vietnamese hands in some form or fashion. The real question is, what did they do with him?
I don't have no idea what happened to Captain McDonnell, but personally I don't think we had enough evidence to declare Captain McDonnell dead, no.
For its part, the Joint Task Force is still trying to resolve the case.
There needs to be some good detective work on it, and there hasn't been. If my dad is alive, if he were alive, he'd be 60 years old today.
Dave Shoup, who served with McDonnell in Vietnam, makes an annual pilgrimage to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. There, at a kiosk that sells MIA bracelets, he bought one with McDonnell's name on it. He says it helps him deal with the fact that McDonnell's fate remains unresolved.
10% of the time, I like to think I'm being realistic, and I try and talk myself out of the fact that John McDonnell is alive. But 90% of the time, when I think about him and how he was trained, I will always think that if anyone could survive, it would be